to work together in teams to create a real difference in their communities, with the support and mentoring of sponsoring MPs at Westminster, including local MPs Andy Burnham and also William Rao. This is a great programme that helps to deliver real leadership skills to our students and at the same time provides something of lasting value to the universities and the communities they belong to. Now, the organisers have asked me to say, and I want to say, that in the light of yesterday's tragic events at Westminster, the ParliaMentors scheme and the debate that we're holding tonight is exemplary in demonstrating how to engage debate and engagement in our precious democracy. Now, the University of Manchester ParliaMentors are, I'm hoping they're in the room, Shireen Patel from Politics, and Jonathan Mason from Law, who's here, Carl Thomas from Physics, who's there, Alia Alakal from Politics, who's here, and Jyotsna Meera from Politics, here. And at this point, I'd just like to invite Shireen to say something of why they chose this topic and this subject for tonight's debate. Shireen.
Hi, so this is essentially our social action project, and we wanted to do something quite interactive, involving not just students but the local community. And since Brexit is quite a hot topic at the moment, and it is quite London-centric, we thought this was the best way to get kind of both students and the community involved. And in this way you can also ask questions directly to the academic experts and to Andy Burnham as well. So we have a Facebook page which we want you to all like because we're going to have pictures afterwards. But also we have a live text in, and the number will be on the last slide. So if you've got any questions, text that number and we'll, during the Q&A, we'll tell Francesca. So yeah, back to you.
Well, clearly I think that you chose a really good subject as demonstrated by the attendance and by the wider online engagement with this debate. So, let me introduce you to the panel. So, to help us address this issue, firstly, to my left we have Dr. Dimitris of the School of Law, whose research looks at all aspects of EU legislation and regulation, so he truly knows what has driven this element of our democracy. Next, I'm going to go right to the end to my colleague, Professor Papadimitriou, who's also chair of the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence in the region, who's written widely on EU enlargement and external relations, and is certainly one of the first people I know to counsel that the Brexit vote may result in a leave verdict. And finally, we're very pleased to welcome to the University Andy Burnham MP, local MP for Lee, and one of the ParliaMentors supporters, who's been a national figure in politics as Secretary of State under the last Labour government for Culture, Media and Sport, and then Health, and latterly acting as Labour's shadow Secretary of State for both Health and Home Affairs. And now, of course, and very relevant to tonight's debate, is standing as Labour's candidate in the Metro Mayor elections. So to business. Some of you have already submitted questions to the ParliaMentors team, and I have 4 starter for 10 questions, which I'll read. They've come from you, but I'll read out them and then invite you to put any supplementary points or questions on that topic, and then I'll turn to the panel and ask for each of them to give their response. So I'm going to sit down at this point, but before I do, I'll say, oh yes, if you're following on Facebook, then you have the chance to take part too. If you send in your question, the ParliaMentors team are going to be able to feed those through. So the first question is, what does the Brexit vote say about political engagement and attitudes to Europe in Greater Manchester? So it's a question about what does the vote mean. So are there any follow-up questions on that topic from the audience? Or shall I go straight to the panel for this one? Well, I'll start with the panel, but be thinking about your questions. I'll give you a heads up. The next one prospects for EU students, youth unemployment and workers in key sectors. So, but don't let those ring fence what you want to ask. You ask what you want to ask. But I'll start by asking our panel, what did the Brexit vote say about attitudes and political engagement in Greater Manchester? Dimitri, would you like to start?
I'll try. That's a really difficult question to answer. And I guess in trying to answer it, you need to think both about the factors that led a significant part of the population to mobilize in favor of Brexit, and also the factors that led others, potentially supporters of Remain, not to mobilize and perhaps not to vote at all. There are many issues associated with it. I mean, why certain groups in our society mobilized for Brexit, whereas others did not or chose to remain apathetic. I think there is a key element to this discussion, and that's something that I feel very passionately about, which is the working class vote. I'm sure all of you have heard about this, or the traditional Labour voter choosing not to engage with this discussion. And there are sections in the British media and in the Labour Party and elsewhere that suggest that somehow European integration in the EU was bad for British working classes, for the British working class, but somehow politicians across the board never mentioned it, ignored it. So the frustration that the traditional Labour voter has been feeling for over a number of years bubbled up during the referendum. Some of them shifted to UKIP, others chose not to bother. And I think that's a really mistaken, in my opinion, reading of the whole situation, because I think that there are many things that have gone against the traditional Labour voters over the years. Europe has been a very peripheral aspect to this plight, if you like, right? I mean, you still have to remember that a lot of people were exercised by the immigration thing, right? And many people still believe that a very substantial part of the traditional Labour vote was alienated by increasing numbers of immigration, and that's something that both the Labour Party and the mainstream in this country never really addressed, right? But you still have to remember that what we are talking about here is a population that is less than 5% of the entire population of the UK. There are many other things that have happening over the past decades, decreasing incomes for lower and middle-class people, falling investment in public services and so on, all of which vastly, to my opinion, outweigh any impact that immigration has had in this country. So to link somehow Europe to the plight of the most vulnerable people in our society is empirically wrong. And it is a great tragedy, I think, that many people, both in the left but also across the political spectrum, never really articulated that what is the danger here is not Europe decreasing standards of living in this country, but it is this country engaging in a race to the bottom, affecting many of the most vulnerable people in our society. Now, I'll finish with this. What you need to consider here is whether this race to the bottom, that undoubtedly is taking place, is likely to accelerate post-Brexit or not. And that is the key question, I think, that faces British politics for the next 10 years.
Well, it's good to follow on, because I agree with a lot of what Dimitris just said. I mean, the first thing, before you consider what the vote in the referendum says about attitudes towards Europe, you first have to just remind ourselves of what was the vote, the referendum vote in Greater Manchester. It was a very, very split picture, to be honest, like the country. The 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester voted quite differently. So Manchester, Trafford and Stockport voted to remain. 7 other boroughs, principally going from the west across the north to the east, so Wigan, Bolton, Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, Tameside, Salford, all voted to leave. And then in numerical terms, it was about 600,000 people voted to remain, 700,000 people voted to leave. So very, very divided picture. If you look at that map, what unites the places that voted to leave and what unites the places that voted to remain? Well, I think the places that voted to remain, you could all say, have kind of probably seen most visible transformation in the last 20 years. You know, they've seen most European investment. So I'm talking about Manchester City Centre, East Manchester, Media City, well, parts of Media City linking towards Trafford, lots of the Trafford borough. That is where the kind of investment, the biggest change there has been in Greater Manchester. And I would say people who live in those places maybe feel that their lives have been improving in the last 20 years. If you look across the north, probably they would say that things have gone backwards. So what does the vote tell us about politics and attitudes to Europe? I think there is a problem in the way European policy worked with respect to former industrial areas, which are largely what those places are that were across the north of Greater Manchester. I think European policy was very good for cities, for the service economy in cities. But I think it was less good for areas that were going through the transition from traditional industry towards a more modern economy. And I certainly saw in my own area how free movement did cause pressure on wages in a low-skill factory context, pressure on public services. And there was just a feeling in a constituency like mine that the issues that arose were not actually, Westminster didn't bother about them and Brussels didn't bother about them. You know, that they were more interested in listening to multinationals than they were in listening to the people. So I kind of felt, although I passionately voted Remain, I have always felt as an MP there was this kind of brewing problem that Europe couldn't see how, on the fringes of Europe, and in those former industrial areas, its own policies were having an impact, but it wasn't coming up with any remedies or listening enough to those people. But my final point would really be, it goes beyond attitudes to Europe, to be honest. I think what those places were saying at the referendum was basically saying, I think as was said, pointing out a sense of abandonment that neither Westminster nor Brussels actually had cared much for what had happened in those places since the very big traditional industry had left in the late 80s and 90s. You know, that was a major social change, a very profound social change, but they got no real help with it. So, and then on top of that, there's a housing crisis, there's a failure to help young people get on in life. So I would say that a combination of issues led to people kind of blaming Europe for everything, when actually a lot of the problems were created in Westminster. But nevertheless, the referendum became a lightning conductor for everything that they felt about what was not fair about the modern world. It was their kind of chance to say things are not working for us. So that really, I think, is what the referendum revealed. The one thing I would plead with people not to think is that constituencies like mine, or many others across the north of Greater Manchester, are full of people who are xenophobic or worse, racist. They are not. Greater Manchester takes more refugees and asylum seekers than any other part of the country, by a long margin actually, many, many more. We do so without any real tensions within our communities. The people of Greater Manchester are amongst the most generous and the most welcoming you will find, not just here in the UK, anywhere in Europe actually. So they are not, this is not a reflection of kind of ill-educated xenophobia. It really is not. This was a cry that said, Westminster isn't listening to us, Brussels isn't listening to us, it's about time they did.
Well, I'm not a political scientist, but I'll try to make 3 points and follow up on some of the points already made. The split vote that Andy referred to reflected the nationwide image. So there was an antithesis between two competing attitudes. Those who benefited from the benefits of the single market, the open market economy, the EU single market, free movement of labour, the young people, the mobility of students, and so on. They had a largely pro-European attitude. Those who didn't see any of those benefits, why should they support the European idea? So for them, what did matter was take back control, sovereignty, domestic constitutional law, national parliaments, and take back control of immigration. So that antithesis fed into the, in my opinion, the sometimes ineffectiveness of a referendum. So people vote in referenda for all wrong reasons. They are frustrated at globalization or at domestic politics. They haven't benefited from any of those benefits that those who travel abroad, who have high salaries, benefit usually. So you vote thinking, I'm blaming the EU for all the evils of my domestic life. On top of that, it was, in my opinion, I realized it was difficult. I've been teaching EU law for about 12 years in the UK. And I've been in Germany where I did my PhD, so there was a different attitude I realized in the UK, which was the domestic politics over the last 2 decades, where the politicians, the government and the politicians, were reluctant to take a leading role to change Europe. The single market was fashioned along the models of the UK economy. So it was the initiative of Jacques Delors, the President of the Commission in the mid-80s, and the UK Commissioner of the day. But then the UK took a rather neutral or passive role. There were a number of opt-outs, so the EU is not the perfect place. It was controversial, but on all quasi-federal or federal aspects of the European Union, the UK, because we are good negotiators in the UK, they managed to get a number of opt-outs. So on all points where the EU was going towards a quasi-federal state, the UK had an opt-out. Opt-out from immigration and asylum policies, opt-out from any new social and labour rights, a rebate, so a reduced budget, opt-out from the single currency, and so on. But at the same time, for any success of the EU, usually the politicians would get credit for all the evils of the EU and the failures and the flaws of domestic politics. They would all blame Brussels. So it was difficult in the last 4 months, since the referendum was called, to undo all this, probably that tradition of blaming Brussels for everything. And I realized there wasn't a number of debates, facts and figures were stated, but people wouldn't listen, because for about 20 or 25 years, since the mid-80s, they were told Brussels was to blame for everything. So, and it was difficult to undo this.
Did you want to come back?
Can I come back
Let
for...
me just see if there's
sure.
Yes.
If the referendum was so divisive to start with, across Manchester, 600 to 7,000 would split across the UK for that matter, was it justified in the first place to hold the referendum? Or was David Cameron taking a bit of a risk in the country's future just to further his own ambitions?
Okay, just hold for a moment. I'll see if there's any other... Yes.
Yes, I was struck by the low affluence by young people. Why did the young voters did not vote on a referendum that really affects the future? So it's a general question of why these people didn't do that. And
Okay, thank you. One more, and are there any coming in online? Julie.
Andy, you mentioned that you felt people in particularly North Manchester felt that their problems that were affecting them weren't being listened to by Brussels and by Westminster. Do you not think that's an issue with centralisation of power, which is increasingly further away from the voters?
Okay, so please don't, if you don't want to add anything, don't, but if you'd like to come back with that question, was it a mistake in the first place? Why were young people in particular so disaffected? And is it about the general nature of centralisation?
Can I just come in? I'm not going to address all of them. There are some people here that are a better place to do that, but I will just touch upon the why the young did not vote, and also follow up on something that Andy said. I mean, Andy is a member of Parliament. He doesn't want to be unkind to his voters, and he's reaching out to be the mayor of Great Manchester. So he doesn't want to offend anyone at all, but I don't mind. And I think where he's wrong, plainly, is the fact that the voters are always right. and that it's not about xenophobia, it's not about bad education, it's not about poor judgment. The truth of the matter is, it is about all three of them, but the way in which these things manifest in British politics are very often very silent. And they are very silent because nobody addresses them in open. The truth of the matter is that the educational system in this country, and I'm not talking about universities, I'm talking about schools, deals with Europe in a very problematic way. Increasingly, for decades now, British schools discourage students from learning foreign languages. The youth and everybody across the electorate would openly say would know very little about Europe. Right? I mean, that is the most common thing you ever hear about. But I don't know, it's too complicated. Why is that the case? And why do we see so many people closing, if you like, UKIP voters that opinion polls can never capture? Well, I think there is a problem. And the more we say to people, you know what, you got it wrong, you got it right, and we didn't listen, we are engaging, in my opinion, in a populist or a pseudo-populist rhetoric that is not helpful. The truth of the matter is that there is xenophobia in British society, and the truth of the matter is that there is huge misinformation spreading. It is increasingly difficult for people to understand what goes on around them. The way in which the newspapers work, the way in which politicians engage with it matters. So I don't think that the British public was right and everybody else was wrong because we didn't listen. I think we need to be more open about the failings that are across British society, and we never talk about it.
Okay. Andy, I'm sure you might have something to say.
Yeah, I will come back to what you said. I understand why you say it, but I think it's a little simplistic the way you characterise what I said or what I actually did, because I voted passionately Remain, and I was out on the streets of my constituency having, quite honestly, stand-up rows about Europe. It was very uncomfortable, but I did it, and I actively advocated a Remain vote all the way through the campaign. And it's not a case now after that of saying, well, now I was wrong and you were right to my constituents. I'm not saying that. It's not a case of the voters are always right. As you say, it's democracy. You've got to respect democracy. Because if you don't, if Parliament had acted, if I'd have voted in Parliament to block Article 50, I think you're setting the seeds then for a real crisis in democracy, a real social division. If people feel they voted, and then there's a kind of some form of another elite that comes along and says, well, we weren't listening to you, we're going to block it anyway. You really are setting the seeds then for society to fragment, and I would argue quite a dangerous way. And it's really wrong. People mustn't do this. They must not equate what I would say are reasonable concerns about the operation of the freedom of movement rules with xenophobia. The two are not the same thing. It is acceptable to have some concerns about the way free movement was working. I would argue freedom of movement within the EU was having a differential impact on different areas. It was not a uniform impact on the whole of Europe. For cities and the kind of service economy within them, I think it was hugely beneficial. For the NHS, hugely beneficial. But in former industrial areas, on the fringes of Europe or on the fringes of cities, where the big industry had been replaced by a lower skill, lower wage economy because they got no real help to bring back quality jobs, it is absolutely clear to me that big companies use the freedom of movement rules to undercut wages in those places. And it's not right for people who are subject to that downward wage pressure to say you're xenophobic by pointing out a concern about it. On the questions, I think David Cameron was wrong, because in the last Parliament we were coming out of a financial crash. So to add the extra complexity and confusion of a referendum was the wrong thing to do. We should have all been about rebuilding the economy without bringing in this new thing. So we opposed it in the last Parliament. I opposed it. We stood on a manifesto that opposed a referendum. I think that was actually a difficult position, but the right position. We lost the election, and then that argument was gone. I really take your point about young people, but I think for the people in this audience, I would say...
Probably they voted because there is a self-selection here.
Sure, I mean, I guess the
interested
majority
in
did, but
politics.
not everybody did.
Yeah.
I think the reason I would say is, for young people, they had never seen a vote affect lives before, really, in that way. And it was a shock, I think, when the results of the referendum came through. It was a political awakening, if you like, because politics had never changed their lives. And so it was the first time that they ever had experienced that. And the point that was made about centralisation, I just think is a really powerful point. And I think in the end, the seeds of the referendum defeat, or if you could call it defeat for Remain, they were sown in Westminster, not Brussels, although I do take on board a lot of the points that were made by Dimitrios. In my constituency, you know, Margaret Thatcher sold off the council houses through Right to Buy and nobody replaced them. The big industry left and nobody brought anything back. Schools were encouraged to focus on the university route, and kids who wanted a technical education were kind of left to fend for themselves. University fees were trebled. EMA was scrapped. You know, these policies had a big impact on areas like mine. And the problem with our highly centralised political system in the UK is the London perspective on life dominates national policy. When you've got the policymakers all living within the M25, they make policies with the London perspective in mind. And I would say national policy in this country has never really spoken to those communities outside. And the alienation was building over many years. And I often heard it on the streets of my constituency. You're all going to get a shock when we vote in this referendum. They saw it as a big moment to kind of hit back against the establishment, wherever it might be, London, Brussels. They didn't really care. They were going to kind of make a big statement at that referendum.
Can I move on to the next question?
If I may add something, yes, on the first question, on the timing of the referendum. I agree with Andy, it was wrong, but it would happen sooner or later. So there was always the public opinion that it was largely believed that the UK people, and indeed they were not asked before the UK joined the European Economic Community. Unlike others, like the Republic of Ireland, they had a vote in 1975 to confirm whether they wanted to stay after they joined. So there was always that frustration. We were not asked, and at that referendum we were tricked because we thought it would be the single market. So I think the timing was wrong, but it would happen anyway. The timing was wrong because David Cameron had promised that he would reform significantly the European Union, would revitalize the relationship between the UK and the EU, and hold the referendum on the question of continued membership. And all this would happen within less than a year. It's unlikely to reform the treaties or introduce any significant and binding amendment to the EU treaties in such a tight frame. The revisions have to be ratified by domestic parliaments across the EU. So he promised a referendum, and he promised a lot of things. The deal he achieved wasn't a bad one. So no one had thought that he could manage to introduce a break and the red card system on the free movement of labour. The deal was good, but had nothing to do with the ambitious agenda that he had promised. So, and that, the impression was that that was not a good deal. On the dissatisfaction of young people, I don't know if that's anything, but I can move on to the centralization of powers. At the same time, the EU was given more powers and more powers from domestic parliaments. So the latest was in the reforms was the Lisbon Treaty. There was a centralization of powers in Brussels in a wide range of fields, from the traditional areas of the single market towards the traditionally domestic policies, including health, employment, and so on, environment. At the same time, there was centralization within the domestic politics, despite the devolution and the devolved assemblies. So there was this idea, probably, and partly not wrong, that all powers were decided by partly unelected institutions. Now, the EU is not unelected as a whole body. The European Parliament is elected directly by the citizens. The European Council, the Council of the EU, that includes all the either the ministers or the domestic governments. The domestic governments are not unelected. The only unelected body is the Commission. But they're appointed, and then they have to go through interviewing, like a strict, rigorous scrutiny in the European Parliament. So there's this idea that they're unelected and they have more powers than they deserve to. So that had to do something with the frustration.
Brilliant. So that was then, the vote has been and gone, and some of the issues that have already been raised are the subject of two of the next questions, so I'm going to mash them up. It's about two key groups of people. So the first question is, what are the prospects for European and international students with UK degrees post-Brexit? And I should say post-Brexit and pre-devolution. And the second question, which is linked, is that youth unemployment in Greater Manchester is a critical labour market challenge, and how can this be tackled in a post-Brexit, pre-devolution or soon-to-be post-devolution agenda? So it's EU international students with UK degrees and more generally youth unemployment. So I'm going to come to Andy first of all.
Okay. I'll go to the youth unemployment question first, if that's okay, and then touch on the UK degrees issue. I think devolution is our chance to, in Greater Manchester at least, get ourselves ahead of Brexit and put ourselves in the strongest possible position to face the new reality, the new world that we are in, because it is a new world, it's an uncertain world. We don't yet know the shape of the deal that we will end up doing with Europe. We don't know how we will be able to succeed in a more uncertain world more broadly. So that very much is in my mind as I've been asking people to contribute to the manifesto that I've been putting forward for my mayoral campaign. It's called Our Manifesto because we've kind of consulted really widely with people across Greater Manchester. But when I consulted, I said one thing to people that was going to be at the heart of the manifesto, and I wanted their ideas on it. I put young people at the heart of what is called Our Manifesto. Why? Because I can't see how, in an uncertain world, we are going to succeed unless we invest far more in the coming generation of young people in Greater Manchester to help them get on in life. For as long as I've been in politics, it goes back to the question about young people actually. There's been a really cynical view expressed at local and national level, and it's simply this, that older people vote. Oh, when you're making your manifesto, make sure your promises are mainly about older voters. And how do you pay for those promises to older voters? Oh, take it off young people, they don't vote. And honestly, that is what you hear when people are discussing manifestos. It was most notoriously seen after the 2010 general election, where promises have been made around the triple lock on pensions, maintaining the winter fuel payment and the free bus pass. How was it paid for? Scrap the Future Jobs Fund straight after the election. It had never been in the manifesto, by the way. Cut the education maintenance allowance, treble tuition fees. For me, that cannot possibly be the right way to run society. You cannot build a prosperous society on that basis. And particularly you can't do it when Europe, when the UK is about to renegotiate its relationship with its major trading partner. So what I've had to think is, well, how do you have a manifesto for the post-Brexit context? And how are we going to keep Greater Manchester where we would always want it to be, which is ahead of the rest, you know, the most forward-thinking part of the country. And for me, it's about saying, invest in young people. So that's the ideas that we've put forward, and the question is, how can it be tackled? I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, we're proposing a UCAS-style system for apprenticeships in Greater Manchester. National education policy, again informed by that London perspective on life, has obsessed with the university route for decades under all governments. And consequently, it's left at least 50% of young people without real clarity about where they're going in life, where school is taking them, those young people who want technical qualifications. So I'm going to propose here in Greater Manchester a UCAS-style system for apprenticeships. So any kid, 14, 15, can find information about apprenticeships in the same way that a person applying for university can find. Alongside that, we're going to introduce a free bus pass for all 16 to 18-year-olds in Greater Manchester, because we want to send them as just a simple message. Greater Manchester is yours to explore, to build, to shape, you know, in a way that they just don't have that kind of message given to them at the moment. And then beyond that, you know, I'm looking at, you know, the post-Brexit economy, also post-Brexit public services. The NHS, as I said before, could be the biggest loser actually from Brexit, because there are so many EU nationals working in the NHS. So given that the NHS is in our devolution deal, I've been having to think, drawing on my experience as Health Secretary, about how we handle that. And the workforce policy is absolutely crucial to the strength or otherwise of the NHS. And the reason why at the moment the NHS is in deficit in Greater Manchester is because there isn't enough nursing staff coming through, and the hospital trusts are having to pay large amounts of money to private staffing agencies. And my worry is, with Brexit and the uncertainty that EU nationals are experiencing, with more leaving possibly, that problem is about to get a whole lot worse. So another policy I'm thinking of there is for young people graduating from Greater Manchester universities in clinical professions, be they as nurses, doctors, midwives, whoever, if they, at the end of graduation, say, well, do you know, I will commit to the Greater Manchester NHS for 5 years after graduating, I'm looking at paying, we are looking at paying off their loans, basically, for every year that they commit to the Greater Manchester NHS. Because we think we can do that because it's better than paying the fees to the private staffing agencies. More broadly, actually, and this may be relevant to you, and then does touch on the question before about the prospects for people with UK degrees, I think we as a city region are going to have to work much harder in the future to persuade as many of you as I possibly can to stay in Manchester after you graduate. We want you here. We're going to need you here. We're going to need you to build our economy. We need your skills. You know, at the moment, about 60% of you go home or go back to London or wherever, I don't know, wherever you, part of the country or part of the world that you're from. We don't want that to happen. We want you to stay, because we want your talent building our economy here. Because if I'm to go around the world and try and attract inward investors from wherever, we are going to have to demonstrate to those investors that we have a pipeline of talent coming through to work in their businesses. How might I have a graduate retention scheme in Manchester? Well, I'll give you just 2 quick examples. We're looking at seeing whether we could give you subsidised startup space. So after you graduate from a Manchester University or Greater Manchester University, could we offer you some subsidised business startup space? Or, secondly, could we offer you a route to the housing ladder that you couldn't get in another part of the UK? For instance, with rent-to-own properties, that you could begin to kind of find your way towards owning a property. So I'm looking at these ideas to create much more support for you for the next generation, because from my point of view, how can Greater Manchester succeed in the post-Brexit context? It's all about your generation. It's all about keeping you here. It's all about lifting your ambitions. It's all about helping you get on in life in a way that politics hasn't done for a long, long time.
Thank you, Andy. Dimitris.
I'll touch upon the question of degrees and the prospects. I couldn't agree more about the UK higher education has been one of the aspects of the UK hub industry. I don't think it will be affected. I mean, the value of the UK degree won't change whether it is pre-Brexit and whether it is post-Brexit or not. So for those of you, the international EU students who come to Britain to study, a UK degree will always be an asset. At the moment, for the international students, there will be no change upon post-Brexit. An international student outside the EU has already come to the UK to study because of the strength of the UK universities and the attractiveness of the UK markets and the UK economy. So provided there is a graduate retention scheme or any other initiative to keep those students, the prospects are gloomy. And then a UK degree is always renowned, has a value for all over the world. For EU students, things will change. Now they have the system of automatic recognition, or there's a system of recognition that prohibits professional bodies in another member state to refuse access to the profession without assessing their degrees If those degrees have been obtained in another member state, that would be the UK. So if they go back home, that would have been easier, the recognition. But this will be one of the most crucial issues of the Brexit negotiations. The transitional arrangements for the EU students who obtain a degree, so what will happen with them, and the future relationship, the recognition of those degrees post-Brexit. And I think this will rank high on the agenda of the Brexit negotiators. So all in all, and for the UK students, and don't forget our students, the majority of our students, a UK degree has always been a very strong degree for any country. Whether you stay here, whether you go to Europe, whether you go to America or China, they will never lose their value. And I don't want to just to start bragging about ourselves today. We're the three academics on the panel here. I mean, I was attracted to UK academia because of the very high quality and the high standards, both in research and teaching. And I think those are values of the UK society and the UK system of education at the high level that won't change, won't be affected by the new environment that is emerging post-Brexit. Now, little to say about youth unemployment, so I apologize for that.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Dimitris, do you want to say something? I know we've got a question coming in. But
I will pick up on the youth unemployment thing because I think that's quite critical. And I think when you look at the prospect of decreasing or increasing perhaps youth unemployment, you have to look at two things, right? One is whether Britain will remain an attractive destination for inwards investment. And how can Britain, being outside of the EU, compete with countries like Ireland, for example, where corporate taxation is very low, where access to the EU is not a problem, right? So you have to think about long-term about this, because it's not going to be an immediate crisis. It will be a slow build-up of a crisis that we might see in a few years' time. So the kind of supply of jobs is very important, and investment is absolutely crucial in this. The other side, of course, of the equation is whether post-Brexit there will be enough money for public investment in training young people, and Andy made some really good points here. Of course, the two are connected, because if Britain loses its attractiveness as a destination for inward investment, the immediate response or the temptation will be to lower taxes. The more you lower taxes, the less money it will be for people to receive help when they need it from the state. So that is something quite important. A little known fact about training and helping with youth unemployment and with the post-industrial decay in this country and elsewhere is indeed the European Union. One of the things that the British government asked for in 1973 when it joined the EU was for the EU to create a fund, what became known as the Regional Development Fund, to help with places up here and elsewhere that are already at that point were experiencing tremendous industrial decay. Right? Now, all of that money, which is tens of millions of pounds that come to the Manchester economy, but also to the Welsh economy, to other parts of the UK, will disappear overnight. If you're no longer a member of the EU, it will go. The question then becomes, will the British government step in and match that funding? Now, as you know, the British government historically, and I'm not making a party political point here, is not very good at these things, right? They don't like this kind of investment. So I worry about this in the same way that I worry about universities, not so much about our ability to attract students. Dimitris painted a very optimistic picture here, and to some extent I agree with him. But UK universities today, and people like me and Dimitris and Francesca and others, benefit tremendously from EU funding that comes to the university, and benefit tremendously from collaborations that we establish with other parts of the EU. Post-Brexit, assuming that the British government will not get a sectoral deal on education, and we have to wait and see about this, we will lose all of that. Will the British government step in to match the funding that would be lost from European sources? Use your imagination. And again, you can make similar points about agriculture, about other aspects of EU investment in this country, some of them criticized for very good reasons, and I'm not painting a perfect picture of the EU here, but think about a culture, a European continental culture, as we like to call it, that prioritizes for decades public investment, and a different kind of political mentality here, where the state is always very hesitant to step in, right? And in an environment where investment may suffer, taxation receipts may come down, all of these things will be very vulnerable. I hope Andy can deliver on his agenda, but Andy himself, as Mayor of Manchester, and other big cities around the UK, may want to do things that will help, but they might not have the money. And let's not forget about this, that good intentions may not find much funding to deliver on what they want to deliver.
Okay, well, I know that there's a question. Shireen, you have a question being submitted online.
Yeah, so we have quite a few questions. I'll start off with two, if we can keep it concise and short. So the first one is, do you think leaving the EU will bring any benefits to Greater Manchester? And then, is it wrong that Brexit relied on misinformation and lies and refused to publish very few statistics and facts, or to even inform the general public about what the EU does? Should the outcome still be valid even if it relied on many false facts and biased speculation of the outcome?
Okay, so two questions there. Yeah. Let me take some more from the floor. This is your chance to ask your questions. I saw yes.
Just off the back of what Dimitris said about taxation, is there an argument for increasing taxation, not just in Manchester, but across the UK, similar to other Scandinavian countries, and not a minimum wage, but more of a living wage, so to speak? And then you have more money to give to things like the NHS, transport, etc.
Okay, I'll take one more.
I have a question about the Erasmus students. How are they going to highlight what's going to happen here?
To the Erasmus scheme, or to...
Yeah, like Erasmus scheme, because still exist, still...
Okay. And yes.
I'm very pleased to hear that Andy say that passionately voted Remain. You say twice, and you say advocate for Europe once, which it was nice to hear for a European thing. But in an interview that you gave to The Independent very recently, you say the Northern Powerhouse will actually improve from coming out from the single market. Will be better off. So I want you to explain these things. You are passionately voted Remain, and when you say passionately, for me it means somebody who's really pro-Remains, and his manifesto will talk about Brexit. And when I read your manifesto, like I think most of us has, I say, where is Brexit in the manifesto? Where is talking about Europe in your manifesto? Why do you say you voted passionately Remain, and I can't see anything in your manifesto?
Yes, question at the back. I'm going to take a round of questions because we're moving up to time, so I think it's better to take all the questions and let you each come back. So yes, question at the back.
You were speaking earlier about the referendum and how it's so important how important democracy is. But like one thing I've noticed about the whole revolution is that in 2012 we voted for Remain, cities voted against even having mayors, including Greater Manchester, and yet we're going to be voting on them this year. At the same time, it's been so private democracy, and people voted against the mayors and also
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3. I'll remind you of what all of these are. You can just reply to the ones that particularly apply to you.
Avoid the difficult ones.
Yeah, one of the panel members mentioned about how you're going to fund all these great, ideas that you have for Manchester. sounds brilliant, you're going to pay back all the medical students and the nursing. I know a lot of my friends and myself would find that fantastic and would stay in Manchester. But they are expensive degrees, you know, they're 9,000 in 5 years,
Yeah.
45,000 hours. How are you going to fund 400 students a year just from my year?
Okay.
It just seems like a lot of money. Where are you going to get it from? Are you going to increase taxation? Or I just wondering what your thoughts are.
Okay, 1, 2.
So Andy was talking about how EU funding is just mostly helps central Manchester. So what's the sort of plan you've got as Mayor to rebalance like the economy across the whole of Greater Manchester?
It's about the question about EU funding. If EU was funding education and all of other stuff, I mean a lot of stuff in UK, I mean there has to be a source for the EU funding, and it has to be assumed from the European countries, and which Britain was part of. So if Britain exits, okay, the funding stops, but even the funding which was going from Britain towards EU, that also stops. So doesn't it just regulate itself, or wasn't Britain a big contributor but more of a taking in the funds and not giving? So how does that economically work?
Okay, well it seems to me that there's some questions here that are particularly directed to our two Dimitris. So that is on funding. Will the UK have more money because it's not paying Europe? Will the Erasmus scheme continue? Was the whole Brexit vote founded on misinformation? If you could address those, and then Andy, I'll come back to you on the particular Mayoral Northern Powerhouse questions to conclude.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Right, Dimitri, fire away.
I'll just say 2 words on whether the Brexit outcome or the Brexit or the will of the people, as the referendum often is described, becomes some sort of a no-go area, and nobody talks about it. And that goes back to the point I made earlier on. The issue about the budget and the fact that Britain will be able to free up a lot of resources from detaching from the EU and then spend it domestically. That's a good question. But we now know, of course, that Brexit will carry with it a substantial bill that the British government will have to pay to the EU in order to continue paying for pensions in Europe, on other liabilities that the European institutions have created over the years, at which time Britain, of course, was a member of the EU, so it's likely that it shares some of that burden. So not all of the contributions that Britain gives to the EU will come back. Now, the question, and this is something that we don't yet know, is what will be the form of Britain's future relationship with the EU? At the moment, I think what the British government is joking for is withdrawal from the single market. The Prime Minister made that absolutely clear. But ad hoc participation in areas of EU activity where the British government feels it's beneficial for it. Education is likely to be one of these areas. I mean, I think they would be mad not to try and establish some sort of a deal that would continue a collaboration between British universities and European universities, continue the Erasmus program, which is hugely popular with young people, and other things. Now, what people need to understand here is that the British participation into these programs will also involve the British government paying money to the EU in the same way that the Swiss do, and the other members of the European Economic Area, and Norway and others, who wish to have access into certain elements of what the EU does. So even post-Brexit, it is very likely that we see the British government contributing, paying a subscription effectively, in order to participate in certain parts of the EU that it likes to do. So not all of the money paid in will be saved. Certainly they won't go to the NHS. We have established that early on. So that's fine. Let's not go there. The other aspect that you need to consider is that in certain sectors of the British economy are doing extremely well out of EU membership. For example, the education sector and universities receive from the EU a lot more than the British government pay into that policy. Right? So there are in certain areas winners and in other areas losers, like the common agricultural policy, for example. Right? So again, the cost-benefit analysis cannot be across the board. You have to look at different areas. But what is certain is that in the areas that the British government would wish to continue some sort of close collaboration with the EU, there will be payment, right? And that needs to be sold to the British people because not many have understood this, right? And we come back to the issue of taxation and whether the British government should increase taxation. I mean, really, post-Brexit, the most unlikely scenario that you will see would be increased taxation. I think where we are heading at, and this is where I think the Brexit agenda comes together with a broader economic and political project, is that the UK becoming a low-tax, continuing, to my opinion, low-skilled economy that will see this race to the bottom that I talked to you about earlier on accelerating vastly, and will end up hurting most viciously the people that were meant to benefit from Brexit, which is this mythical working class that has been so hard done by Europeans. And I think this is my sort of kind of scary scenario, but I don't think I am a very bitter person, but I also like to think that there is an element of truth in this kind of thinking.
Okay.
I agree with on many points with Dimitri there. I'll take the point about the so-called Brexit or the exit bill in the way that it has been described in the media. It's like it's not a way to punish Britain for leaving the EU. When they say there's a heavy price to pay or there's a bill waiting, they also mean that the UK has committed itself to participating in those either development or investment projects or research or education projects until 2020. So the Brexit negotiations and what has been described wrongly, in my opinion, and very negatively as the bill, the divorce bill, the liabilities include state pensions for the workers, the UK workers, the UK pensioners who go to Spain or to live in another member states, participation in Erasmus and mobility of students programs, funding of education and research, not only until 2020, but maybe also for the future. Now, that's a separate agreement. That will be part of the so-called future relationship. If there's no deal, there will be no such funding. I mean, we can establish that. No deal is not better than a bad deal. I don't think there will be a bad deal. But the UK has decided to leave the single market, so it's going to be probably the least worst, the agreement. Such an agreement will have a number of priorities: trade in goods and trade in services, especially because the UK economy is largely services oriented. But it will also have aspects such as participation in funding projects, and I agree with Dimitris on that. So the UK has never said they will stop paying into the EU budget. They said we will stop paying large amounts of money. That means we now have Norway, Iceland, countries outside the EU, the core of the EU, that participate in Erasmus and research funding programs and so on, and investment programs. I think the Regional Development Program, Interreg, also applies to the Balkan countries and third countries outside the EU. So they will probably try and have a deal to participate in investment projects, funding for research and education, and that will entail liabilities and obligations. So, but it's wrongly described, and I think it will be difficult to sell it as a divorce bill.
Thank you. Andy, the last word can go to you. Just
Oh,
let me
thank you.
remind you. So,
Yeah,
the vote on mayors, can you rebalance the economy? Where's Europe in your manifesto?
Yeah.
And anything else you'd like to think?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to pick up the living wage tax question at the end, actually. I think that's a really kind of crucial question, actually, that I just want to finish on. But the question that came by Twitter as well, or Facebook, asked about any benefits, and this actually links to the comment I think I made in The Independent. With everything, nothing is ever all completely bad, I don't think. There's always some good in something, some bad in something. The benefit that there may be in Brexit, in my view, is possibly more flexibility over the EU state aid rules. And again, I'm going to come back to my analysis that the rules of Europe have affected different areas and different industries differently. So if you think back to last year when the steel industry was under real pressure, do you remember when there was accusations of Chinese steel dumping and that they were going to have to turn off the blast furnaces at some of the big plants, Port Talbot and in Redcar in the northeast? Those facilities never come back again if you lose that kind of heavy engineering. So traditional industry can't ride the kind of ups and downs of the world economy these days as easily as service industries. Service industries in the cities can just scale up and scale down. They're more people-based. The big industries are not. And actually the inability of governments to step in and shore up those big facilities in downturns, I think, is an example where the EU state aid rules are more detrimental to some industries than they are to others. And again, I would come back to my analysis that the European rules as they've kind of been developed over years were more favourable to cities than they were to former industrial areas, because the state aid rules kind of had a more detrimental impact on traditional industries. And the point I was making independent, I didn't say that I don't think that Brexit would be beneficial overall. What I did say is that it may give us more ability to invest in our own industry again and build up an industrial base again. Because if I am Mayor of Greater Manchester come May, I won't hesitate to put public funds behind building up what I perceive to be the industries of the future. And I may have more ability to do that if we're not as bound by EU state aid rules anymore. So the digital sector in Manchester, the low carbon green sector, the renewable, the advanced manufacturing centre and graphene and all of the things coming out of the university, I would want to put public money behind those things to capture the benefits of Greater Manchester. And I may have more ability to do so if EU state aid rules are not being enforced in the same way. And on the manifesto, to be honest, there was quite a lot of mention from memory of Brexit and of Europe. Well, we could come back to that at the end maybe. But the point being, the whole manifesto was a response to Brexit, the whole thing. The point I was making before about the younger generation and policies to invest in the younger generation are a response to Brexit, a pragmatic one, because we're not going to be able to rerun the referendum from Greater Manchester level. We have to now live in the world that we are now in and develop a manifesto that responds to that world rather than rerunning the arguments of last year, because that's not going to get Greater Manchester anywhere.
Can I just say something?
Very briefly.
For the referendum, the EU citizens were not allowed to vote. At the mayoral elections, the EU citizens will be able to vote. We can vote for the local elections.
For the last time.
Probably. You're right there. It's probably. But we can vote, and we can make a difference. And we will make a difference in a way, because we are educated, we are passionate, and we felt hate crime going and rising up. So we do fight at the moment that we feel that now is the time for us to say what we believe in.
Absolutely.
So if you embrace us, that's fine. I read all the manifestos, the UKIP one, and it is a challenge to spot the difference between the Labours and the UKIP.
Can I give you a very direct answer? I do embrace you, because my wife is one, so I do know very much how you feel, because she feels exactly the same. Immediately after the referendum, as Shadow Home Secretary, I called a vote in the House of Commons to give status immediately to all EU nationals living in the UK, and the vote was carried without any opposition, actually, and yet the government still didn't do it. Last week, I voted again in the vote that was in Parliament to give EU nationals status. Immediately. That is one part of confusion they could deal with right now. And I actually believe the Prime Minister has mishandled the Brexit negotiations in many ways, actually. She's got backs up in Europe, but actually she hasn't recognised the contribution that people are making right here, right now, to our services. And it seems to me that she's prioritised the interests of British nationals who've chosen to make their life somewhere else over people who are living here, working here, contributing to our public services. And I can't believe that that is what the government has done. So I have advocated for you, since the referendum, the manifesto is more about a Greater Manchester agenda. It's not necessarily going to rerun the arguments of Brexit at a national level, but I do take the point you're making. On the democratic point about Manchester and Manchester having voted against, you're quite right. Manchester City voted against a mayor to replace the leader of the council. But that isn't the same as a mayor for Greater Manchester, because it was just Manchester City Council, not the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester. However, you have a real point in that George Osborne imposed this Northern Powerhouse. He didn't impose it, he kind of offered a take it or leave it deal to Manchester, part of which was to have a mayor. So it wasn't chosen by the people here, it was imposed top down. That's a very imperfect way to arrive at the point that we're at. But having said that, I do still feel that this at least offers us more chance to run things for ourselves. No matter how bad it was in the way that this was arrived at, I still think it's worth grabbing hold of. But I do, I take your point. There's a lack of democracy in the way that this has been constructed, and that is a very fair point. In terms of how do I fund my pledges, well, I'll give you 2 examples actually. On the NHS staff point, it is about switching the money that we're currently using to pay private staffing agencies because of the staff shortage. And it's basically saying that if we persuade people to stay here, we will switch the money that we would have been spending getting agencies to bring staff in from all over the country by switching that money to people who've made a commitment. It is a 5-year commitment, so we are asking for a deal here, but I think that's a good deal for younger people. I hope many would think that that's a good way to do things. On the bus pass that I promised, we have demanded here in Greater Manchester the ability to re-regulate our buses. Back in 1986, Margaret Thatcher basically imposed a market free-for-all in bus travel on Greater Manchester. So the buses can do what they like. So they're nose to tail outside your university down Oxford Road. But you go to a more isolated part of Greater Manchester, there's nothing there at all. They can choose, they can put ticket prices up to whatever they like. They don't have ticket machines that interact with each other, so we can't have an Oyster card. The services are, they can withdraw services at a drop of a hat. We're going to get the power to re-regulate our buses, like London always has been able to regulate its buses. And as part of that deal, I'm going to say to the bus companies, okay, I may give you a longer term contract to run the buses, but in return we want free travel for 16 to 18-year-olds. So I'm trying to cleverly fund things. I take Dimitri's point completely. There's not going to be a great deal of money around, but what I am trying to do is do creative deals to give value to the younger generation, and that's how I'm going to fund the pledges. In terms of rebalancing Greater Manchester, I couldn't agree with you more. The leave places need more attention than they've had. That's one of the reasons why they voted in the way that they did. The city centre has boomed and there's a lot of momentum and energy here now, but we need the same sense of future in those other places. So I'm talking about switching the housing fund that we have to rebuild higher density development in places like Oldham, Rochdale, Bolton. And the part of the deal may be, under my graduate retention scheme, that they're the rent-to-own properties, so we persuade or we give an incentive for younger people to go to those places and start to, as they have in parts of London where younger people went to East London and started to change the whole feel of the place. That's the idea. We want to encourage you to rebuild those places, but you get a quality of life there because they've got a lot to offer as well, those places, and they're connected to the city centre. So that's part of the thinking about rebalance. They're not retail destinations, those towns, anymore. They've lost the shops to the out-of-town shopping or online shopping. Make them really high-quality residential centres, linked to public transport, linked to high-quality cycling infrastructure, persuade young people to go there. That's the plan. That's all right. One vote for that, one vote for that. And then the last point is this point about inequality, which you touched on in your question about the living wage and tax. And I think we've had a really interesting discussion tonight, and I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think in the end, the referendum result maybe goes down to that, actually, that in the last 20 years, we have actually seen accelerating inequality in our society. Globalization has not been great for everybody, it really hasn't. People at the middle and higher third of companies have started to do very well, but those at the bottom have actually not just had pay taken off them, security has been taken off them as well, so they're living on temporary contracts, short-term contracts, 0 hours. society's become very different over the last 20, 30 years. And the gap between those of the lowest paid in companies to the highest paid has actually got quite a lot greater. And I think that is some of what was coming through the referendum. This world is just not working for us. It's not fair to us in the bottom third of society. And a point was made by Dimitris about Jacques Delors. In the early 90s, Europe it was more of a social Europe that we were building, as I remember it in those days, where it was more about workers' rights, you know, basic standards, but bring up the floor so nobody can be exploited, and there can't be a race to the bottom because you don't allow one country to undercut people on workers' rights. Don't let workers be the negotiating chips in building a new economy. And that was very much the kind of Europe that I believed in, a social Europe, a people's Europe. It kind of changed, I think, and I think it was probably when the Dutch, the British, the German mentality came a bit more to the fore. And it was more then about neoliberalism and about putting rocket boosters on globalization and using free movement to help big corporations. I think it lost its way.